Thank you for joining us. So my name's Nasamir. It's really great to welcome you all and our speaker today on behalf of the journal Identities, as well as Casey at Lancaster, which is the Centre for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities, alongside sociology at the University of Glasgow, to this, which is our second of a trilogy of anniversary lectures, which mark the 30th anniversary of the journal Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power. Now, in our very first issue, the founding editor, Professor Nina Glick-Schiller, set out the case for a new journal as follows. She said that cultural politics has emerged as a means of either maintaining or resisting domination, and in ways that demand fresh and dedicated analysis. Now, some 30 years later, spanning methodological approaches, geographical traditions, intellectual registers, Identities, I think, has established itself as an interdisciplinary space for such a kind of analysis, and which is also reflected in today's speaker. Professor Claire Alexander has researched and written on race and ethnicity and identity for over 30 years, and her publications are like milestones in a tradition of inquiry. She's the author of The Art of Being Black in 1996, The Asian Gang in 2000, The Bengal Diaspora Rethinking Muslim Migration, co-edited in 2016, and most recently, The Asian Gang Revisited. And she does all that whilst also being the head of the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Manchester. But most importantly of all, of course, she was a former editor of Identities for 7 wonderful years between 2012 and 2019. And so if you had any papers rejected during that period, send all your comments to Claire. We're really delighted to have Claire with us and speaking on this important topic. Just a minor housekeeping issue at the beginning, which is to say that we will be recording this lecture. We'll pause at the point of the Q&A, but we're also going to keep the chat closed during the lecture and open that up when it comes to that point after Claire's finished speaking. So Claire, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Okay, thank you, NASA, for that introduction. And I want to thank NASA and the other editors of Identities for this very generous invitation to give this lecture in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the journal. And I'm really grateful too to everyone that would find a couple of hours out on a Tuesday morning, even in half term potentially, to come along too. And it's really nice to see some familiar faces. I feel like I'm amongst friends. I was a little bit worried on Zoom because you can often never tell who's going to be kind of in the room. And yeah, so I feel better. So thank you all so much for coming. It's really nice to see some old friends here. I'm delighted to take part in marking this important milestone and to be in such esteemed company with Catherine Hall and Jean Beeman, who are the other speakers in this series. I was reflecting that when I took over editorship of the journal in 2011, I inherited a box of, and it was literally a box of 6 articles, I think it was, to all paper copies, which was the sum total that the journal had in its kind of in tray at that moment in time. And partly because a bunch of submissions had got lost in a hurricane or something. So it was kind of really disturbing. So I'm really pleased, and it's really great to see the journal in such strong health. So with a strong and increasing impact factor, a diverse editorial team and board, and the fact that it's continuing to innovate through its blogs and podcasts. It's much more imaginative as a space to publish than it was when I was editor. Particularly its continuing support for early career scholars and scholars of colour. So anniversaries are reasons to celebrate, but they're also reasons to reflect on where we are now, on how far we've come, on what we've lost or achieved along the way, and what our future may hold. So I wanted to start by pausing and reflecting on Identities, the journal, before thinking about how identity and identity politics have changed over this period, where we are now and what the future holds. And I had a whole plan to be kind of optimistic, but actually, spoiler alert, it's just mainly quite grim. So just to manage your expectations on this. So NASA mentioned Nina's vision for the journal. And in the article that launched the journal in 1994, Nina Glick-Schiller wrote that, quote, "Identities, the journal, responds to a paradox of our time. This paradox encapsulates two poles in thinking about identities. On the one hand, there's the celebration of increased global cultural connection and diversity, underpinned by the mass migration of people and objects and the growth of new technologies, connecting us in new and interesting ways. On the other, we see the persistence of old forms of identities and the emergence of new forms of difference and defensiveness, so a kind of closing down. So Identities, the journal, was itself a reimagination of the journal ethnic groups. It was renamed as a way of acknowledging this moment of transition, challenging bounded ideas of what Glick Schiller describes as, quote, primordial passions and age-old ethnic rivalries, denaturalizing the ideas of tribes, races, ethnic groups, and nation states. It's not accidental, I think, that Nina and the foundations of the journal are in anthropology. So for her, Identities, quote, opened our pages to explorations of the multiple processes by which cultural representation, domination, and resistance interrelate, interpenetrate, and intersect. While Glick Schiller emphasizes the need to reckon with the ongoing inequalities of power and domination, for those of us entering the academy at the time, this is aging me, I realize, but the prevailing mood of the 1990s was one of optimism and possibility. So the theoretical encounter with postmodernism and post-structuralism, alongside globalization, and what seemed at the time, perhaps prematurely, the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall, premature proclamations about the end of history, had certainly opened up the possibilities for identities as a concept, not as a journal, as being more fluid and open and unanchored by social expectations and social categories. So this swing in the identities pendulum towards openness, complexity, and contingency is clearly presaged in Stuart Hall's iconic and iconoclastic New Ethnicities article, which was published just first in 1989. And the tension he explores between old and new identities, old and new ethnicities, to use the title of one of his more famous articles as well, which was published in 1991. So for Hall and for all of us, identities now came without guarantees. My own doctoral and postdoctoral work on Black and Asian youth identities in Britain, I think to a large extent encapsulated that optimism. I think perhaps in hindsight, a little bit naively. So although I had an eye very firmly on questions of power, racism and racial stereotyping in shaping the lives of the young men in my ethnographies, the focus was nevertheless very much on resistance, subversion, negotiation, complexity, creativity. So on identity as an art, which is where the title of the first book came from. By the time that I and my associate editors, who were Brett St. Louis and Raminda Kaur, relaunched Identities in 2012, I think it's fair to say that some of that shine had probably gone. And I think in the UK, that shift can be traced to the months between the publication of the Macpherson report on the Stephen Lawrence case in 1999, the Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000, the launch of Cool Britannia, and that moment of a kind of vision of a more inclusive Britain that for about 5 minutes, New Labour seemed to bring with it. And then the Northern Riots and the launch of the War on Terror in 2001, where all of that just went out the window very quickly. In our editorial, and I think inverting Glick Schiller's emphasis, I think of it as kind of pushing the pendulum back the other way, maybe. So our foremost concern there was with the resurfacing of old and the reformulation of new exclusions and identities. And more than that, we were concerned with the ways in which the politics of difference, which had kind of dominated that discourse through the 1990s and 2000s, were being played out in academic, political, and public arenas in quite problematic ways, often as an alibi for the continuation of business as usual. So in our relaunch essay, we asked, quote, whether the study of culture and identity retains the disruptive interventionist power that it once had, or whether it's become a substitute for critical and political engagement and thought, both modish and mundane. And I think we largely thought it was the second. We had a relaunch lecture for Identities in 2012. I don't know if any of you came to that at the LSE. Memorable because it was Paul Gilroy, but also memorable because Idris Elba was in the front row, which was slightly distracting. But anyway, in this lecture, Paul Gilroy argued, quote, "A new balance has to be struck between explanations of race politics that focus on structural and institutional failures, so the business as the old business as usual, and the need to confront emergent forms of raciology more consistent with the agentic, individuating rights-based approaches to difference and diversity that characterize neoliberal dogma and corporate multiculturalism alike." So the way in which questions of race and racism had become more and more individualized, more and more fragmented, and the way in which that undermined any kind of collective action. So presciently foreshadowing the discourses of white marginality, the resurgence of the far right, and the racist riots that erupted this summer, Gilroy also notes the need to, quote, "revisit the relationship between the demotic eruptions of racial hatred, which have lately emerged as a popular form of entertainment, and the formal political pronouncements of our more recent political leaders on the subjects of race, multiculturalism, and citizenship." So again, that tension between the kind of individual, the popular, the public, and the institutional, and how we connect those different things. Now, 12 years on, the questions I think are the same, but things feel quite a lot worse. So the war in Ukraine is in its third year. The most recent conflict stage in the conflict in the Middle East enters its second year with 42,000 dead and rising. Neither shows any sign of resolution. Indeed, with the attacks in Lebanon and the arrival of the North Koreans in Europe, things look set to deteriorate catastrophically. Climate change and war, and by war I'm thinking both civil and civilizational, have displaced millions of brown and black bodies who perish in the Mediterranean Sea or the colder Channel, or who huddle in camps under attack from police and border guards or hostile natives. Across Europe, the far right's moved into the mainstream, and in Italy and Austria into government. Scandinavia and the Netherlands have long shifted rightwards to accommodate their right wing into their political centres. And France has only narrowly escaped a right wing victory, and I think we can say for now. India, Turkey, Australia, even New Zealand. New Zealand was my imaginary haven of last resort. Even there, people have lurched further rightwards and reneged on the kind of promises of multiculturalism and equality. So I think of this as the great moving right show goes global. Meanwhile, China expands an authoritarian reach over enemies abroad and at home. We all watch aghast at the upcoming US election with margins too narrow to call, even though one candidate is Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not quite sure what else one could say about that. And let me say, we don't have a huge amount to be smug about in this regard here, given that we elected Boris Johnson and then got stuck with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So just saying. In Britain, the all too brief flicker of hope in a new Labour administration has been extinguished much quicker than I'd expected, actually, in the deluge of sleaze, scandal and summer rioting. While the Rwandan deportation plans have been shelved, the rhetoric around small boats and asylum seekers has barely moved the dial on anti-immigration discourses. It's really hard to tell any difference between this and the previous administration, I'm afraid to say. In the aftermath of the attacks on hotels, housing asylum seekers, and on mosques, our PM had to be reminded by a question from a journalist to condemn racism. What we might laughingly call the opposition is a choice between Kemi Badenoch, culture warrior extraordinaire, who thinks that some cultures are inherently better than others and wants to deport anyone who criticizes Israel, can I just say a foreign country, for being un-British. Hashtag not all Muslims. And the alternative is Robert Jenrick, who's best known for ordering the painting over of a cartoon mural in a reception for asylum-seeking children. At this point, frankly, a bungee jumping Ed Davey and an all-white Lib Dem party looks like the closest we have to political statesmanship in the absence of a lettuce. And frankly, I think if a lettuce stood, they probably would have got quite a lot of votes. And I'm not saying anything about Farage and Reform because, frankly, I don't think they deserve the oxygen, and certainly not mine. So all of which is to bring me to my title, Identity Politics in Treacherous Times, although the phrase overtaken by events springs to mind. I was actually considering changing the title to Identity Politics at the End of the World, but I decided this was too much like a kind of Netflix mini-series. In fact, I think it may have already been made. So the question before the class today is what to do. And in a time of global political crisis, identitarian hard men to the right of us, authoritarian self-righteousness to the left, does the politics of identity get it done? It's probably fair to say that the simple answer is no. Certainly identity politics has, like political correctness or wokeness or even progressive, become an easy label for the right to dismiss demands for social justice or equity. It hasn't fared that much better on the left, where it's mainly viewed as divisive and ideologically suspect. And here I'm thinking of Sivanandan's scathing critique of Hall's new ethnicities approaches, for example. But I think it's also true of more contemporary class warriors. I think it's also true even in the current government. There's real skepticism around kind of race-based policies and claims. It's also true, of course, that we've seen the term seized by those on the right and the left to claim a politics of victimhood. So we have a kind of racial bandwagoning where it seems everyone is oppressed by everyone else and everyone or no one is to blame. The appeal to white marginality in evocations of the white working class or the left behind, both of which are, I think, quite highly gendered concepts. These are predicated on exclusionary nativist concepts of white, usually male, privilege and entitlement. However, they may be dressed up in good-hearted ideas of kith and kin, or what Les Back has identified in current white identity politics as a discourse of self-love. The drink. However, before we throw away the identity politics baby with the culture wars bathwater, it's worth recognizing the transformational role of identity politics in reconfiguring movements for equality and social justice. Our contemporary society is inconceivable without the struggles from the 1950s onwards, which were based on personal characteristics and their associated ascribed social meanings and positions around gender, race, sexuality, disability. We could think back even earlier. So the suffragettes, I guess, would be one of the first clearly movements around using identity politics. The recognition that the personal is political underpinned the women's, the civil rights, and Black Power movements. Black is beautiful. Placards with the simple words, I am a man, black and proud, still have the power to inspire and still bear repeating today. These are the foundations for Black Lives Matter and the histories that echoed through that and across those decades. Importantly, though, these movements never remained simply at the level of the personal. Identity politics were never simply about the individual or the groups. They were around alliance, connection, solidarity. In the UK, black and white unite and fight, or we are here because you were there, which has now been taken on as some kind of weird Radio 5 slogan, which is deeply problematic. But anyway, but those phrases from the kind of 70s were a recognition of interconnectedness, both positive through a shared class position and negative through a recognition of the imperial entanglements. I was recently at a workshop on identity politics at Glasgow, and I think some of the people are actually here today. And they're running a really fascinating AHRC project on race identity and political mobilization in France and the UK. And so I really want to thank them because those conversations I had in that day really helped me kind of formulate what I was trying to say, which is not to pass the blame onto them if they're there. But there, Satnam, who I saw was in the room, Satnam Verdi reminded me that these early forms of identity politics were always also class projects. They were demands for structural, economic, and political change. They were never simply about recognition or inclusion in the world as it was. And those two things class, structure, materialism, and culture identity are inseparable or should be. Now, of course, these movements were not without their problems and their fractures around race, gender, religion, sexuality. In the UK, class was an increasingly significant form of difference, although it's most usually understood through the fracturing around ethnicity and religion. So the ideas of the Muslim underclass that came up in the 1980s, for example. Yet recognizing these fractures and some failings should not undermine the importance of these movements and the alliances that they forged. So increasingly, I think of identity politics as the Hamlet problem, not as in to be or not to be, because I think we could assume that these movements all aspired to be, even if what and how to be were more contentious. But in the kind of, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Identity politics is neither inherently progressive or regressive. It could be neither, it could be both. Rather, it's a matter of context, something that has to be placed historically, socially, politically, and with complex layers of belonging, alliance, and exclusion that can play out locally, nationally, or globally, and meaning different things in each of those layers. So the one thing identity politics is not is simple. And I'm thinking here particularly, thinking of some work that we've been doing on Brick Lane with the Bengal Diaspora project that Nasser mentioned. So I'm thinking particularly of the Bangladeshi youth movements in the 1970s in East London, and they mobilized Bangladeshi communities into hamlets around the kind of activism of the National Front, but I mean particularly around the racist murder of Al-Tabali. But this struggle had its roots too in the secularist independence war in Bangladesh. Many of the people that we spoke to for that project talked about had come out of that struggle for independence in Bangladesh and come to Britain because of that. At the same time, it reached back to the anti-fascist struggles of the Jewish community in the 1930s, and there were very explicit calling back to those particular movements and lessons that were learned from that, the Battle of Cable Street and so on. It reached across to socialist workers, to the politically black, Race Today collective, and the British Black Panthers. So Rama Murthy's book in 2013, Black Star, on the Asian youth movements, or Satnam Verde's book in 2014, Racism, Class, and the Racialized Outsider, both point to the longer and broader reach of these mobilizations and the way in which they link to colonial histories, but also to contemporary global Black Power movements. So there was always a lot of different things going on in what seemed like local specific mobilizations. So as with the idea of nation or state, identity and its accompanying politics can be thought of as open or closed. And here I'm thinking of Hall's opening to the Perec report, as it's normally thought of, the Runnymede Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain report published in 2000. And there he speaks of ideas of the nation as being either exclusive and exclusionary, inward and backward looking, or as outward facing, inclusive and heterogeneous. And he says this is a moment to make that choice, and we did make that choice, and it was the wrong choice, as it turned out. These formations, though, change according to context and over time. We can see this, for example, with the national history national curriculum, which I've been doing some work on for a number of years with the Runnymede Trust. And that swung between often very insular ideas of national identity or more inclusive multicultural formations, largely dependent on which party was in power. For those in the academy, closed formations are usually considered to be negative and reactionary, but they need not necessarily be so. They're the foundation of most colonial independence movements, for example. The danger is when these strategic essentialisms are mistaken for reality. And of course, the politics associated with open or closed identities are very different. They may be exclusive or inclusive, formed through alliance or opposition. founded upon empathy and imagination, or policed at the boundaries through essentialized inscriptions of authenticity and belonging. Unfortunately, things are rarely black and white, and that pun is intended. The recent racist riots in the UK show the complexity of identity politics in Britain, with keyboard class warriors tying themselves in knots, trying to find political meaning in the sight of middle-aged fathers and grandfathers and women with prams braying to burn asylum seekers in their beds. Meanwhile, culture warriors and politicians of all stripes were trying to justify or ignore the attacks on mosques, as if this was not really actually Islamophobia, and as if no one could understand how decades of religious and racial hostility, anti-terror policy, and immigration legislation had brought us to this point. Meanwhile, as one of my PhD students, Mahim Pratap, informed me, the Hindu right were aligning themselves with the rioters, I think on that kind of basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it turns out that one of the key platforms supporting the violence was run by somebody in a garage from Pakistan. As my colleague Gary Young said in his wonderful lecture to mark the 25th anniversary of Identities, this is a quote, "Identity is like fire. It can create warmth and comfort or burn badly and destroy. It can make connections over oceans, languages, generations, and cultures. But it can also sow division amongst those who live side by side. On the one hand, we are all more alike than we are unalike. On the other hand, the ways in which we are unalike matter." For Young, the contemporary politics of identity carries more pitfalls than potential. He notes, there is always identity in politics, but that does not mean there is always politics in identity. Not all identities are political or even social. Some are strictly personal. He's rightly, in my view, critical of the creeping tyranny of experience and authenticity. And he argues that while the personal may indeed be political, it's a starting point, not an end goal. That, to quote Gary again, it's not about you, it's about us. Or as my favorite sociologist, Terry Pratchett, would say, personal isn't the same as important. For Young, identity politics is both, quote, the starting point for some of the most inspirational moments in politics, the end point for some of the most insidious. He's particularly critical of the politics of representation, the idea that exceptional individuals can stand for and transform the position of the group. This was something that was particularly cheered by the champions of post-racial utopia now, as I think of it, after Obama's election, or closer to home when Meghan Markle married into the royal family. And we all know what happened after both of those happy endings, although, of course, recollections may vary. For me, more troubling is that what would have been once characterized as the burden of representation, the idea that standing for the group and bearing its kind of failures largely was a pressure, has now become a demand for inclusion on the basis of these very particularistic and increasingly narrow racial identities. The rush to be first, to be the representative individuals that can be counted and measured and ticked off on institutional diversity monitoring forms, while providing cover for the ongoing business of racism as usual. We see this a lot in the academy. As Young writes, we're talking about systems, not individuals. A corollary to the triumph of individualism as racial politics is the resurgence of essentialism, with a side order of authenticity seasoned with lived experience. Lived experience is one of my least favorite, most meaningless expressions, I think, of the current moment. In this time of growing crisis about everything and everywhere, lines of identity are hardening, barricades are built, bunkers are being hunkered into. Race, faith, class, gender, sexuality, nationality become not just handy descriptors or forms of social classification, but weapons and containers, anxiously policed against transgressors from within and without. And this happens through the bordering practices of the state, by land, sea, and air, in the toxic ether of the Twittersphere, but also in the mundane moments of everyday encounter. So we might think of this in Gilroy's terms as kind of anti-conviviality. I think a good example of the complex slipperiness, technical term, of this moment can be seen in what I think of as Coconut Gate. So this, I mean, you'll all know this, but was the recent prosecution of teacher Maria Hussein for committing a racially aggravated public order offence for the apparent crime of carrying a placard at a pro-Palestine demonstration, which showed the faces of Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman superimposed onto coconuts under a palm tree. Now, as well as a highly public court case in which she was eventually acquitted, the incident spurred endless column miles of press coverage and media outrage, marshalling the forces of the state and the wounded egos of its representatives on one side, and the arbiters of anti-racist identity politics on the other. Now, certainly, there are questions to be asked about this, about who has the right to freedom of expression and who does not, about how the powers of the state most usually wield legislation around hate speech and incitement to racial hatred to silence the very people these laws were, in theory, supposed to protect, about why coconut was considered so much worse than a white councillor referring to Rishi Sunak as a fucking P word. He didn't say P word, obviously. About how and where Sunak and Braverman, irrespective of their ethnicity, lost the remaining shreds of their humanity, and what the fact that they thought this gave them political kudos says about the rest of us. About when playground taunting and name-calling can be seen as political satire or defended unthinkingly as parts of Black intellectual thought. This is a slippery slope. As Keenan Malik has written in a thoughtful article on this for The Guardian, those who challenge fashionable contemporary norms, such as the politics of identity, can be dismissed as being too white. It's a form of gatekeeping that allows some individuals to appropriate for themselves the right to define what a Black or brown person may say or believe to remain authentically Black or brown. So Malik's title is, for the article, is Too White, Too Black, Too Woke. Politics by labeling is a disease of our time. Okay, so to shift from Hamlet to Romeo and Juliet, because I do have a degree in English literature. What's in a name? I've written previously about the fragmentation of racial solidarity in the UK, particularly around the demise of political Blackness and the rise of what Stephen Andon so evocatively captured as ethnic enclaves and feuding nationalisms. And I don't want to rehearse those arguments here. And I also acknowledge that political Blackness was not without its problems and omissions, but nevertheless, I think it's worth reflecting on what was lost along the way. So the first is a loss of a sense of shared struggle. As we moved from coloured to politically Black to Black and Asian, from Black to Black Caribbean, Black British and Black African, from Asian to Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi, to Muslim, it seems our sense of shared identity of who we are shrinks and fragments. Our complete inability to find a collective label, immigrant, Black, BME, the generally reviled BAME, people of colour, which I quite like, but is slightly kind of 1970s retro and also very American, I think. Racialized minority, which is kind of doesn't trip off the tongue. Global majority, which, you know, I'm not even sure, who knows who that includes and who it doesn't. All of these reflect a broader struggle over what we share still, if anything. The recognition of difference and complexity has not led to greater freedom and acceptance, but to a retreat behind smaller and smaller labels, layering difference upon difference, guarding them jealously. Identities become part of a zero-sum hunger game in which there can only be winners and losers. I think of this as identity top trumps. The second loss is one of change and choice. that as essentialism rears its head on all sides, there's a retreat to the idea of primordial identities and antipathies, back to Glitschiller's ideas of kind of races, ethnicities, tribes, nations. Identities are seen as fixed, as unchanging, shrink-wrapped at both an individual and collective level. Increasingly, we're expected to choose an identity or choose a side, which seems these days to amount to the same thing, and accept all that comes with this, for good or ill. Increasingly, we're expected to stay in our lanes, to embrace binary ways of thinking, acting, or being, and particularly where these binaries are kind of viewed in very clear kind of terms of moral or political worth. The third, and relatedly, is a kind of loss of empathy. To see across the barricades, to look up and out, to imagine ourselves in the place of others, to go beyond tolerance to understanding, even though understanding doesn't necessarily mean agreement. So for me as an ethnographer, this is a particularly difficult shift. After all, ethnography is ultimately an act of imagination and empathy. You try and put yourself in the worldview of one's informants, and then to take that and translate that to others. I've had many conversations with younger colleagues and PhD students who are very clear these days about who can and cannot study racism and in what ways. And of course, there are legitimate arguments around this. There's a history of work on race that is littered with poor research and bad faith. And there are arguments too about the institutional framework, about who gets jobs, who gets published and who doesn't. So I understand those, and I think those are important discussions, but I think they should not be used to bring down the shutters. I'm a big fan of reflexivity and thinking about my relationship to my research interlocutors, to think about how my own position impacts what I see and what I don't see, if that's possible to know what you don't know. And that's an integral and essential part of my practice and my writing. However, does that mean that only Black people should study Black people, Muslims study Muslims? Does that necessarily make the work better than work by outsider others? And for the racial insiders, what about gender, class, sexuality, age? And is the logical endpoint of that to say that ultimately we're only qualified to study ourselves? And that was a very big thing through the kind of 90s, certainly in anthropology. But the question has to be then, what's the point? Now, I'm acutely aware that today I probably would not have written The Art of Being Black. I think there were people at the time that thought I should have written it then too. I would have probably thought twice about the Asian gang. I did think more than twice when writing The Asian Gang Revisited, which probably explains why it took me over a decade to write it. But would it have been better if it had not been written? Would it, if the books had not been written, would they have been better if I'd been Black or Muslim? Certainly they would have been different. And certainly they could have been better. I mean, things can always be better. But would that be down to simply to my being Black or Muslim? When who or what the author or researcher is becomes more important than what they do or what they write, that seems to me to be a problem. So where do we go from here? Gary Young has argued that since, quote, identity politics has been rendered meaningless, the logical thing for all right-minded people is to retire its use. And while I have some sympathy for this argument, to simply retire identity politics does not undo the initial problem it was seeking to address or redress. While acknowledging its many perils and pitfalls, whatever version of identity or identity politics we choose, the underlying problem of racism and inequality still exists. In the UK, while Britain is now more multicultural, multiracial, and multi-faith than ever, entrenched patterns of exclusion persist in health, housing, education, employment, issues of racism in key institutions, government, the police, as we discovered from the news this morning, school, universities, the NHS, the post office remain. Visceral and violent racism on the street, in our police cells and prisons continue or are on the rise. In the current global context, these entrenched inequalities are overlaid with new and the resurgence of old forms of violence and exclusion: xenophobia, asylophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. This violence, political, economic, symbolic, embodied, more and more embodied, often remains identity-based. It's against Black people, Muslims, migrants, asylum seekers, Jews. Stephen Andon once commented, quote, "The personal is not political, the political is personal," i.e., it has lived and violent effects on individuals and groups. Now, I would want to slightly amend this to the personal is political and the political is personal, although I suspect Stephen Andon would almost certainly disagree. I think there are real dangers in ceding the field of identity politics to those who would claim it for themselves uncontested. This was one of the things that Stuart Hall noted was one of the key lessons of Thatcherism and one of the reasons that the left took so long to catch up. Young himself argues, quote, "We should not leave symbols to the symbol-minded." Stephen Andon, and I suspect Hall too, would both agree, though, with the return to issues of structure, the materialist turn or return, which we've seen across the social sciences, although now inflected, I think, really importantly with the recognition of the absolutely inescapable role of race and racism in that. And I'm thinking about Gargi Bhattacharya's work on racial capitalism or Satnam's book, which I mentioned earlier. Both of those spring to mind. We've also seen the engagement with questions of history, notably in the decolonization movement at its best. The entanglement of then and now alongside the there and here as ways of anchoring identities and exploring the roots of the present in the past to create a more equal future. And these are important moves. Now, these are not new pathways, but nor are they simply retreading the same old ground and arguments. The tension between old and new identities and their reckoning with power, with history, with culture, were always part of the theory of identity politics, certainly the theory, perhaps less so the practice, as is the necessary dialogue with the changing present, with all of its complexities, ambiguities, and horrors. We need to understand the current conjuncture and fight those battles on the terrain of the now. The question is one perhaps of emphasis, what Hall calls bending the twig. What is the current moment, and what version of identity politics bends the twig to allow for new ways of thinking, acting, being, and becoming? What leads to a more equal future? What gets it done? So the issue for me is one of balance, I guess, of where we pause the identity pendulum at the moment, to recognize the pull of history, to name the role of power in shaping identities, even as we resist its creeping absolutism, to embrace solidarity without insisting on sameness, to acknowledge change without the fear of loss and letting go, to look up and out and across and find new ways of living together. We can see glimpses of this in the mass global mobilizations around Black Lives Matter or the pro-Palestine marches. Or we can see it on a smaller scale in the anti-racist coalitions who faced down the far right across Britain's towns and cities this summer. These are not easy alliances. There may be differing agendas or perspectives, and perhaps some strange and unwelcome fellow travelers, but there is at least a sense of possibility. How and if that translates into meaningful change, of course, is yet to be seen. Experience says no, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. So this is to move beyond the familiar and comfortable labels and differences that we no longer even seem to question. It's to stake a claim for empathy and altruism. And I'm not suggesting that we should go back to black, much as I view that period with the rose-tinted spectacles of a weary middle age. I know that moment has long passed. However, we do need to keep sight of what we're fighting for and why it matters. What brought us together in the first place? What made us who we are? As Stuart Hall would say, This requires us to move beyond either or to both and, or as Gary Young would put it, to imagine a world in which you might thrive, for which there is no evidence, and then fight for it. Thank you.